Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and start the webinar and let people come in as they join. So welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar on the impacts of wind and solar projects to the local economy. This is our fifth webinar this year, and we're really excited to present this webinar on a really interesting topic. First, let me introduce myself. I am Megha Hamal. I am the Chief Strategy and Communications Officer of the Illinois Power Agency. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, we have muted all participants upon entry. We will be taking questions towards the end, but please feel free to submit your questions in the chat window, and we will be answering them. Today's session is being recorded, and a recording of the session would be available on the IPA website under events. Couple of points that I would like to emphasize. The webinar is for general education purpose only. So it does not represent a legal representation or a statement of policy by the IPA staff. And then we just want to again emphasize this is strictly educational. So we hope it would be educational and informative for the listeners. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed speakers for this session. Our first speaker for the session is Anthony Starr, Senior Advisor and Interim Planning and Procurement Chief here at the IPA. Anthony joined the agency in 2013 as the IPA Director. Prior to joining the IPA, Anthony served as a policy advisor to two chairmen of Illinois Commerce Commission. Before entering the public sector, he spent 13 years at the Center for Neighborhood Technology in a variety of leadership roles working on energy policy and environmental sustainability. In this webinar, he will provide an overview on renewable energy development in Illinois. Our next speaker is Dr. David Loomis. Dr. Loomis is the Executive Director of the Institute for Regulatory Policy Studies and Professor of Economics at Illinois State University. As a thought leader in the energy space, Dr. Loomis has published 38 research articles in leading journals such as Energy Policy, Energy Economics, Utilities Policy, Environmental Law and Policy Review, and more. Dr. Loomis is the president of Strategic Economic Research, which performs economic impact analysis for energy projects across the U.S. In this webinar, Dr. Loomis will be discussing economic impacts of historical wind and solar projects, including job earnings and output. Our last speaker for the session is Scott Tess. Scott is the Sustainability and Resilience Officer for the City of Urbana. He supervises the Commodities Recycling Program, co-manages the Landscape Recycling Center, and is responsible for working with the Sustainability Advisor Commission to implement the city's energy, water, and waste priorities. Scott is also responsible for managing and redeveloping the city's closed landfill as a solar farm. Additionally, he leads the city's resilience efforts with a focus on continuity of operations and urban biodiversity. Again, those that are new to our Power Hour webinars, welcome. This is a series of educational and informative presentations on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. Again, as I mentioned, this webinar is intended for education purpose only, so we will try our best to answer all your questions. And if we can't, given this is just an hour, we have provided contact information of our speakers towards the end, and please feel free to ask them questions after the webinar or send them any questions. So I want to quickly talk about the upcoming Power Hour webinars for July and August. For July, we will be discussing unpacking community solar and Illinois Solar for All. There's just a lot going in this program right now, so we want to kind of give you a high-level overview on what's happening there. And then the August Power Hour webinar focuses on public school category within the Illinois Shines program, and we'll discuss how schools can take advantage of state incentives. So if you want to register, please go ahead and register using the links below, or you can simply go to about our website under About IPA Events. A little bit about our agency. The Illinois Power Agency was created in 2007. We are responsible for the development of annual electricity procurement plan for customers of electric utilities. We also support the development and implementation of Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a public policy designed to increase the development of renewables here in Illinois. And through the Illinois RPS, we also develop long-term renewable resources procurement plan, which serves as a roadmap for renewable energy and procurements here at the IPA. And we also oversee two solar programs, Illinois Shines and Illinois Solar for All. Our vision is to create a clean, reliable, and cost-effective energy future for residents and businesses across Illinois. With that, I would like to welcome Anthony to kick off the presentation.
Great, thank you, Megha, and thank you everyone for taking part today. What I'm going to start out, as Megha described, is do sort of a high-level overview of renewable energy development in Illinois, and this should sort of set the stage for Dr. Loomis and Mr. Tasser to get into some of the details about what this really looks like in terms of numbers and economic impact. So next slide, please. So just a quick framing, I suspect many people are fairly familiar with this, that Illinois has a renewable portfolio standard with ambitious goals of 40% of our electricity being supported by renewables by 2030, growing to 50%, and then through the 2040s, move towards full decarbonization of the electric sector. Where we are today leaves us a lot of room for moving towards that, those goals. We're at roughly 10% of the electricity being consumed by the customers of large utilities being covered by renewable energy credits, the way we support renewables. But there's also a lot of renewable energy in Illinois that I'll discuss in a moment that's not part of the renewable portfolio standard. So if you look at that, in fact, the numbers are a bit higher. Also, these numbers through 2022, we saw a number of large solar projects come online sort of later last year. So I think looking at annualized data probably represents where we really are today in terms of solar deployment in Illinois, plus the ongoing impacts of more and more community solar and rooftop and ground-mounted solar for homes and businesses. So these numbers are constantly changing and constantly developing. We're focusing today on Illinois, but I do want to also note that the Renewable Portfolio Standard for Illinois can also be supported by projects that are located outside of Illinois that meet a certain public interest criteria. So we are really operating within a regional electricity market, and there are ways in which projects outside of Illinois will be part of the mix of what we're doing to achieve clean energy goals in Illinois. Looking at it from a percentage of installed capacity, the latest numbers from the end of 2022 were that about 18% of the capacity, electric generation capacity in Illinois is renewable resources. This number is higher because renewable projects don't operate as many hours each year or at full speed as other sorts of generation. Each megawatt of capacity will generate fewer megawatt hours of electricity. If you want to see more data on this, our 2022 annual report has a lot more breakdown, the detail of where numbers are in terms of the amount of renewable energy in Illinois, the amount that's sort of projected to come online, et cetera. That's something that we'll be again updating next year, and have other plans for beginning to publish more information. In general, if you want to get deeper into all the nuance of the Renewable Portfolio Standard, we have a number of other power hours you can watch that will go much more into information on those. Next slide, please. So this is sort of a quick overview of sort of what I think of as the growing scale of renewables in Illinois. As Dr. Loomis will show in a slide coming up, there really were two waves of development we've seen on wind. There was a big movement from roughly 2007 to 2012, where we saw a lot of wind come online, and another boom from 2018 through 2021. What I find interesting about this is that we have our renewable portfolio standard. It's a way in which we have a state policy to encourage the development of renewable energy in Illinois. Yet most of the wind projects that are in Illinois are not supported through our procurements. They're either supported through corporate customers or perhaps selling their renewable energy credits into other state RPSs, or perhaps just relying on energy market revenue for the wind energy. So while the Renewable Portfolio Standard has had a significant impact on wind development in Illinois, I think it's important to remember that it is not the full picture of what's happening with wind. So we're in a little bit of a lull right now in wind. I know there are a lot of projects that are sort of under consideration. What's holding those up? There's a lot of different things. One is that there is ongoing delays at the regional transmission organization level in terms of interconnection approvals. And there's a lot of projects that are proposed that are in various queues for approval, but it's not clear how many of those projects actually will come to development. So again, I think there's a lot of potential for wind. How it will play out over the next few years, it still remains to be seen. Another factor is that wind projects are large projects. They tend to be hundreds of megawatts these days, covering hundreds, if not thousands of acres of land. So these are very big projects. So you might not see much, but then you might see one or two projects come online, and that will really show a lot of development. While with solar, we're seeing bigger and bigger projects, we also are seeing a lot more medium-sized projects. So there's more granularity in solar development that I think probably makes its development look a lot smoother. There are also ongoing concerns related to the Renewable Portfolio Standard budget and the impact that would have on the financeability of large-scale wind projects that are participating in IPA programs. That's something that the IPA has been obviously monitoring very carefully, and we hope that there will be developments in the coming year or so that will be able to address that. Solar looks very different. Prior to roughly 2018, there was only about 80 megawatts of solar in Illinois. Now we're over 1,800 megawatts, and that number is continuing to grow daily. And almost all of this has been supported by IPA programs and procurement. So if you these numbers in terms of the increase of solar in Illinois are really astronomical. This is a huge increase, and we're at paces that could continue for really seeing huge amounts of solar to continue to come online in the coming years. And we're at the IPA really deeply invested in making sure that this happens. And as you can see, this is something that's been very significantly relying on our programs. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show a series of maps I think hopefully will give a picture of what this looks like at a statewide basis. So the first map on the left here, these are the projects that have been supported by procurements run by the IPA that are up and running. Combination wind farms, solar projects. The little blue boxes are where we've had some solar that are brownfield site solar projects, smaller projects that are creating opportunities to reuse land. These are the utility scale. Scott will be talking a little bit later about a community solar project on a landfill. That's a really interesting alternative way of thinking about how those redevelopment opportunities. The slide in the middle shows projects that are under development right now because of the procurements that the IPA has run. These are projects that are under development but are not yet completed. This includes a number of projects that were just approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission yesterday, quite a few solar and brownfield projects that will continue to sort of increase the penetration of large-scale renewables. The final slide on the right, this is from a really fascinating database that's kept up that has every single wind turbine in the United States in it. And so this is just sort of gives you a sense of the geography of these projects and where, and a little bit more granularity in terms of how they're spread out. If you go to that website, you can zoom in down to the really seeing the individual locations of each parcel. So if you're really curious of seeing what's the land coverage of of wind in Illinois, this website is a really wonderful tool. I am not aware of anything in the public domain on solar that provides as much information. Maybe someone will develop that at a national level eventually, but if you want to dive deeper into wind, it's a wonderful resource. Next slide, please. So what does it look like for smaller scale solar? Here are a number of different maps that sort of give a picture of that. On the left, this is the distributed generation projects that have been energized through the Illinois Shines or Adjustable Block program. We may, these are numbers from yesterday. I would bet we're probably over 40,000 today as projects continue to be verified by our program administrator. As you can see, solar is spread out across the entire state. homes, businesses across the state have been installing solar in huge numbers over the last several years. And this is just the projects that have been completed. There's thousands more projects under development, new applications coming in every day to sort of further spread solar out across the state. The center map is the community solar projects that have been completed. Over 100 projects really helping Illinois be one of the leaders in the country on community solar. These are larger projects that allow multiple subscribers to share from the benefits of them. There also are a lot more projects under development. So over time, this map will continue to fill out as more projects in more regions of the state get developed. And then on the right is a map showing the progress of the Illinois Solar for All program. This is our program that supports low-income households and communities, where you see blue dots are nonprofits and public facilities across the state that have benefited from that program. The red dots are where we've had low-income community solar projects coming up. And then in purple, you'll see areas where we've been able to support solar for individual low-income households. That program is still mostly seen its impact in northern Illinois, where we're running some pilots coming up later this year that will seek to expand and learn how to reduce the barriers to allow there to be more single-family low-income solar development across the state. Next slide, please. The Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, which was the major legislation that passed in 2021, created some new focus for the IPA in terms of looking at what we're doing to ensure that there is sort of more economic diversity and opportunities across the state as the clean energy economy grows. So there's a lot of different ways in CEJA that happens, but I want to focus just on a couple of them. The minimum equity standard, opportunities for equity eligible contracts, and specific carve-outs we have in Illinois Solar for All. The next slide, please. The minimum equity standard is a standard that requires that portion of the workforce for projects that are participating in our programs to employ what are known as equity eligible persons. And there's 4 different ways in which someone can be an equity eligible person, depending on if they've come out of certain job training programs, if they were formerly in the foster care system, were formerly incarcerated. But what I want to focus on in particular is the residents in what's known as equity investment eligible community. That standard is starting this year, which is the first year it's beginning to take effect at 10% of the workforce. That will grow to 30% by 2030. So a focus on ensuring that we have a diverse workforce around the state. If you want more information, there's a link here, and we'll be posting these slides and a recording of this presentation on our website after the conclusion of today's event. Next slide, please. So just to give a picture of what that looks like, the green areas are the equity investment eligible communities across Illinois. They're spread out across the state, combination of what we call environmental justice communities and R3 communities, which are a designation of community areas that came out of the cannabis legalization process. And the point I want to make here is that there's a real focus now in the legislation of finding workers who, coming out of disadvantaged areas and making sure that they have the employment opportunities as the solar industry and the wind industry continue to boom in the state and have opportunities to participate like other sectors of the workforce have done. So this is an important way, I think, of making sure that the benefits of this economy, of this clean energy transition, is really felt statewide. Next slide. Another opportunity that's made less geographically focused, but again, I want to emphasize because of its opportunities to create opportunities for new types of businesses, is what are known as equity eligible contractors. They're basically businesses that are majority owned by equity eligible persons. We have a dedicated portion of the Illinois Shines program for projects that are submitted by approved vendors that are equity eligible contractors, and opportunities for them to have opportunities of the advance of capital. This is a way in which smaller emerging businesses that may have financing challenges that larger, more established businesses don't have, can have the program sort of pay them portions of the proceeds prior to the development of projects to help make it easier for them to develop those projects and to get their foot in the door of being part of the development community for renewable projects. So this is a way in which we're sort of helping bring the benefits to more business sectors than we previously had. We also have consideration for certain community solar projects for the use of equity eligible subcontractors. Next slide. I also want to mention the Illinois Solar for All program for a moment. This is the program that supports low-income households and communities. In this program, we have a number of carve-outs for projects that are in environmental justice communities, as well as projects that have what's known as energy sovereignty. Energy sovereignty is the idea of increasing local ownership and control over projects, so ensuring that the local community benefits from a project. That's not just sort of something that's put into a community and the value of it flows to others. So we have this dedicated idea that in environmental justice communities, and then also for nonprofits and public facilities, a focus on a broader set of low-income communities. Again, this is a way to ensure that the benefits of renewable development are spread out across the state and not just clustered in higher income or areas where the benefits won't impact the local economy quite as much. Next slide, please. A couple other things I just want to highlight that also would have an impact on local economies is that there's a requirement now since CEJA passed for prevailing wages for most projects, most categories of projects in our program, with the exception of residential projects and those that serve houses of worship. This is a way in which we are helping ensure that there are good paying jobs in the solar economy. We expect that there's a bill that passed the General Assembly this spring, awaiting the governor's signature, that will likely expand that requirement to the Illinois Solar for All program. We also have requirements for utility scale projects that they have project labor agreements. So this is, again, just another way of ensuring that the jobs that are being created to build new renewable energy projects are good, solid jobs. So there's many, many more things we go into in terms of how we're supporting development of the economy of Illinois on renewable energy, but I will stop there and turn it over to Dr. Loomis, who will go into some really fascinating numbers about what this means in terms of economic impacts.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks for inviting me to join you today. Next slide. We're going to take a look at the economic impacts of wind and solar energy. I am going to just be looking at utility scale wind and utility scale solar for these numbers. Next slide. I wanted to mention our conference. This is my shameless plug. I used to run this conference for many, many years, and we had to end in 2016. And so we're picking it back up. It'll be September 20th with an evening reception, but all day September 21st. It'll be in Bloomington Normal at the Marriott Hotel, and you'll see some familiar faces there. Anthony Starr will be speaking, Brian Granahan, and many in the audience will know Chairman Doug Scott as well will be speaking. So just encourage you to take a look, and hope if you're interested in a wider view of renewable energy in the state, that you'll come out to see the conference and be further educated as a result of the different panels. Next slide. So I'll march through kind of the growth of the industry, and I have some graphs that really illustrate well what Anthony was talking about in terms of the lumpiness of growth in the wind industry. Also take a look at solar growth, and with each of those, we'll look at the economic impacts associated with those in terms of jobs, earnings, and output that come along with those. As well, we did a property tax analysis, and I have a shout out to Kate Kostrub, who led this effort on our behalf in updating this analysis with the tax records here for 2022, and make some quick conclusions. Next slide. So when we look at the wind industry, Illinois ranks 5th in installed wind capacity behind Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Kansas. We have more than 3,500 turbines operating in Illinois, as Anthony said I went to double check these, and it's even more now, but this was as of the time that we had pulled the data. So this is really a moving target. We're seeing more and more installed and operational turbines. But you can see clearly in the graph, we've got this era from 2007 to 2012. You see tremendous growth in the industry year by year. And then we had a dearth of activity in 2013, 2014. And then you see the pickup with 2020 being the high watermark in terms of installed capacity here in Illinois. Next slide. I would say that this is really geographically diverse, given the wind resource. So really to cite a wind project, you're really looking at three things. You're looking for, number one is a good wind resource. And so you want it to be in a windy site. And even though Illinois looks to be very flat, we do have some elevation and topography that does influence where spots are windier. And so there are some places that just don't have enough wind resource to make it economically viable, given the current turbine technology to run. But nevertheless, we've got quite a diversity of different counties that have sited utility scale wind farms. 25 different counties have been involved. Another 5 have the potential to come online in the near term future. McLean County, where I live, has the most wind capacity. And yet that as the top county still only has 17% of the overall state wind capacity. And you have other counties like Bureau County with 7% and LaSalle and Logan counties, Bureau County with 9% and LaSalle and Logan counties with 7% each. And some of those may be adding to that capacity in the near term future. Next slide. So when we're trying to calculate the number of jobs that will be impacted during construction and during operations, economists are going to measure that in 3 distinct buckets. The first one, and the one that gets touted most often, is those direct jobs. Direct jobs are, during construction, are going to be construction workers, but they're more than just construction workers that are working on site. They would include development and anybody who is directly employed by the development company or their EPC contractor to do the construction on the site. What I find interesting, and we've found this throughout the time that I've been looking at doing this analysis, is that the supply chain impacts, or what economists call the indirect impacts, are dwarf the direct impacts. So indirect impacts are going to be things like materials, supplies, services that a wind farm is going to need during construction. It could include turbine parts. So the turbine itself, if it were to get towers or blades or component parts like gearboxes and other parts within the nacelle, all of those things would go into those supply chain impacts. And finally, induced impacts is looking at those impacts that come because people have more jobs because of the direct and indirect impacts. And they spend money in their local economy on ordinary household purchases. So you can see that we, out of the 44 largest wind farms, and this is wind farms that are 50 megawatts or higher, we've eliminated the wind farms that early on only had a few turbines there. And this is the 44 largest wind farms. You see over 31,000 jobs created. For brevity and sake of time, I did not include the earnings, but these are very good paying jobs, both during construction and during O&M, especially during the direct and indirect. I would say induced induced jobs tend to be lower wage jobs, because those are ones in grocery store jobs, entertainment jobs, retail jobs that will tend to be lower paying than the other two. You see a more equal weight in terms of direct, indirect, and induced impacts on the operations, and those numbers are lower. But remember that the O&M jobs are ongoing jobs that will last the lifetime of the wind farm, whereas the construction jobs, they are normalized to be a job year, but they're short-term in nature, and those construction workers will move on to another construction project after the completion of this one. Next slide. Let's turn now to the solar industry. Next slide. And you can see that whereas we had a longer history in wind, we have a shorter history in terms of solar in Illinois. And in particular, I'm going to look at the utility scale solar, and you see that it's only been in more recent years that that light blue bar even makes its appearance onto the graph. More long-lived has been commercial with the yellow bar, and the green bars with community solar. So I'm going to focus again just on the utility scale solar for the economic impacts. Next slide. And here, obviously, numbers are much smaller. We measured the 7 largest solar utility scale solar farms and found 2,840 jobs created or supported during those construction period. It's a little more even in terms of direct versus indirect or supply chain jobs there, with a non-insignificant amount of induced jobs. Again, on the O&M side, you get a little bit bigger impact of the indirect impacts rather than the direct impacts. Some of those functions like vegetation management that will tend to be outsourced may be in that indirect impacts and will drive that number higher than if they had solar technicians doing vegetation management on the solar farm. Next slide. We did a property tax analysis, and in this property tax analysis, we looked at all of the both utility scale and utility scale wind, as well as utility scale solar projects, and looked at every tax record across the state. So we pulled these off of actual tax records and compiled them. So next slide. In the total, this is including the tax records that we could get for 2022. Most counties have their 2022 tax payments available. There's just a few counties that have not posted their 2022 numbers, and of course we couldn't collect those. I'll point those out in a later slide. But from 2003, we found the total being $478 million in property taxes. Now, you have to remember that Illinois currently has a standard valuation for both utility scale wind and solar based on the number of megawatts or size of the project in terms of capacity. And so the discretion of the assessor or the variability from county to county has been taken away, and there's a standard valuation. The valuation actually, as I've looked at projects across different states, is actually very high. So the amount of property taxes that are paid for a utility scale wind or solar projects tends to be much, much higher in Illinois than it is in other states. We saw over $59.1 million last year alone. That number will climb because, as I said, we had a few counties that haven't reported that. The biggest beneficiary in terms of property tax revenue goes to local school districts. In every jurisdiction that I've looked at, the local school district is well over half of the property tax bill in any given parcel of land. We found another $60 million going to county governments, close to $30 million going to community colleges, and close to $25 million going to fire districts. Next slide. You can see that the numbers have climbed. They climbed quite a bit. You see kind of a leveling off on tax revenue by year at around 2013. If you remember, in 2013, 2014, we didn't add any new wind farms to become operational. So it kind of flattens out. And then you see the numbers increase. You remember 2020 was a very large year. That was our high watermark. And you see a jump from 2020 to 2021 in terms of the tax revenue. Next slide. So again, this is just recapping, but in a pie chart form. We saw $302 million going to school districts, $60 million to county, community college. But notice that everybody benefits in terms of taxing jurisdictions. You get the road and bridge district, township district, library districts. And many jurisdictions, many areas have very unique taxing districts based on their local characteristics and needs and so forth. And so there's unique properties that if they're within the taxing jurisdiction, the wind or solar project will be paying property taxes on that. Next slide. Here's just a look by county. And so you see McLean County having the most wind farms, also having the most tax revenue by county. You see Bureau County, Lee County, LaSalle County. These will be affected, obviously, by the tax rate. So you have a standard valuation per megawatt, but if you have a higher tax rate, all other things equal, they'll receive more tax revenue for that. So it doesn't, it correlates, but it's not an exact equation through for megawatts to tax revenue. Next slide. So this is, again, just the summary by county. And I'll go to the next slide to save us some time here. And next slide. I know this is a dizzying array of numbers, and I don't expect you to look at it, but I wanted to point out a few things that are kind of behind the numbers, but and illustrate this on this table here. You can see one of the reasons. This is the top taxing entities in terms of the total tax revenue over time that they've received, and you can see the number one by far is Ridgeview School District in McLean County. This they've received $23.4 million in tax revenue. Well, this happens for two reasons. One, they got one of the very first large wind farms in their jurisdiction. The Twin Groves Wind Farm in East McLean County was covered a good bit in Ridgeview School District. So you see they started getting tax revenue a part year in 2007, but you see more in 2008 and 2009. That's largely because the project came online in phases. And then you see that it does start to depreciate, but they were the beneficiaries of having additional wind farms come in to their taxing jurisdiction. And so it's the combination of longevity. They've had wind farms for a long time, and they're adding continually to the wind farms. The second is Unit 5 school district, which is where my kids attended when they were younger. You see Tri-Valley as well was a beneficiary early on of that Twin Groves. I also want to point out Iroquois and Ford County have not posted their property taxes. So you'll see blanks there for Unit 124 for 2022. They're still in the top 10, but we still have not received what was paid in 2022. Same thing for Unit School District 10 in Ford County. Ford County has not posted their tax records. So that's kind of the top 10. You'll notice all 10 are school districts, with the exception of McLean County. McLean County government moves in there at number 7. So with that, we'll leave it and happy to answer questions as that time comes. Thank you.
Scott, it's you now.
Great. Thank you for having me. Glad to have all you on the call. You may know there was a windstorm that came through Central Illinois yesterday. So I'm at Public Works running on generator backup. So hopefully we will make it through together. Happy to share. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And the next. So the project I'm going to describe in a certain sense starts in the 1920s. Urbana has been operating a landfill within the city limits on the northeast side of town since the 1920s. That landfill finally closed in the 1980s. As you can imagine, there were multiple iterations of landfill cells. The oldest part of the landfill really wasn't a cell. It was some lowlands along a stream that garbage was pushed into and then burned and then buried. Later on, garbage was simply buried. And in the most recent cells that were closed, there still wasn't a requirement at that time to have plastic lined landfills, but at least the new cells that were most recently closed do have a clay cap to work to shed water off of the closed landfill. Next slide. The yellow boundaries are the parcels of our closed landfill. There's multiple parcels. We have made good reuse of this closed landfill over the years. Those lines that you see in the middle is our landscape recycling center. We also have a police firing range and a police and fire training range on this closed landfill. Next slide. But even still, we have a balance of land that, believe it or not, it's hard to sell a closed landfill. I haven't got any takers that want to buy a closed landfill. That leaves a balance of land that we have to manage. Generally speaking, you want to keep trees off of a closed landfill, as they may risk breaking apart that clay cap underneath the turf grass there that sheds water off of the landfill, keeps it from going into the buried garbage and interacting and moving pollutants around. This is a continuing problem, not unlike a lot of old closed municipal dumps in Illinois. It's hard to find funding for vegetation maintenance on a closed landfill. Next slide. So with this in mind, we followed the development of the Future Energy Jobs Act in Illinois. And as it was passed and we were waiting for the effective date, read through some of the provisions and prepared a request for qualifications for a landfill solar developer to use up that balance of land on our closed landfill. We very consciously used a request for qualifications rather than proposal or quote, because at this early stage that we wanted to attract and secure a developer, really a lot of the details of how the incentive programs would work weren't totally known. And so it would be difficult for a developer to give us, say, a lease price or an off-taker price. So instead, next slide, please. Instead, we used a request for qualifications approach, and we asked the developer to tell us why they would be good at doing this kind of project on this kind of property. We ended up selecting SunPower, which is a global company now majority owned by Total. They do both manufacturing and installation, development, and owner and operation of solar arrays. We used a two-part process with SunPower, a lease option and then a long-term lease. The lease option secures the land for SunPower to go to the utility company and get an interconnections study done, go to the incentive programs and apply for incentives like FEJA, Future Energy Jobs Act, and go to banks and secure financing, and then finally go to anchor tenants, off-takers, who would ultimately buy that electricity. So the lease option is a very small amount of money that they pay to hold the land for a period of time while they work to put a project together. Next slide. So we were successful. Well, I should say, like so many others, we were not successful in winning incentives in the lottery. The lottery had a ton of interest for community solar incentives, but we were successful in the qualifications-based incentives program for the low-income community solar. And we in fact won 2 incentives. So I'm going to show you some images, but there's technically 2 solar arrays on our closed landfill. We won 2 different incentives. So what started out as about 40 acres of surplus land ended up being about 20 acres of actually leased land. So we converted that lease option into a long-term lease. Next slide. And this is what it looks like about 85% completed. Ultimately, it would be about 5.2, 5.3 megawatts completed. And that left and right side is the 2 different projects. And you can see we've got our arbor shop or landscape recycling center shop there on the bottom part of the slide. Next slide. This array is estimated at somewhere around 500 to 700 households is kind of the amount of electricity it provides. In this image from Google Earth, you can see that the array is finished, and you can see where it's situated between the interstate and our landscape recycling center. Next slide. This, well, it's nice to mention the estimated carbon sequestration is equivalent to what 7,500 acres of US forests sequester every year. So that's a nice statistic. This image is really important. One of the critical elements of our lease agreement, in terms of what we initially wrote and in terms of what we negotiated, was we wanted a ballasted system. You can see that the solar module racking is attached to concrete blocks themselves on top of aggregate platforms. The aggregate platforms kind of smooth out the undulations, the natural undulations of the landfill. But we wanted those ballasted instead of screwed in, again, because we did not want to disrupt the clay cap. And even, you can see, even the fence posts are ballasted. They have a concrete block on holding down some base racking on those poles. So nothing is going through the cap. Next slide. So there's a ton of benefits to subscribers for a low-income community solar subscription. There's no upfront costs. There's no cancellation costs. You income qualify once ever, and it's a 50% cost of electricity. So anyone in Ameren territory can subscribe to what ultimately became Nexamp's community solar array on Urbana's closed landfill. But with benefits like this, we've promoted this to our own residents, wanting them to capture as much of the value as they can. Next slide. There's additional benefits to the city. We're really stacking them up here. Of course, we're adding clean, renewable energy to the grid, reducing pollution. We're increasing access to renewable energy. We are moving all of that vegetation maintenance that I talked about on closed landfills, we're moving that off of our books. The developer does that. They cleared that site of a lot of woody vegetation that would have cost the city a lot of money. And then the city gets to purchase a portion of that electricity from the solar array. We are in fact powering most of the Urbana City building, our city hall, from that solar array. Next slide. Even more benefits. We got our 15 years of lease payments up front in a series of checks because there was multiple parcels, just legal reasons. But I can tell you, I was very pleased to deliver $600,000 in checks to the city administrator in one fell swoop. This property also becomes taxable. It was not on the tax rolls before it was a municipal landfill, but it becomes taxable as it is now a commercial use. And that is, of course, a cost of business paid by the developer. In our instance, $33,000 a year combined. Next slide. And of course, we're just copying and pasting that same model I described. We still have a balance of land on the west side of our landfill. You can see the existing solar array on the east side. And we've gone through the same process. We've selected a developer. They've applied for an interconnection study. They're going to be applying for community solar incentives, lining up financing, and I will work with them in lining up some local anchor tenants. And we will do this all over again and hopefully get the rest of our landfill filled up. Next slide. With that, we'll take any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. I'm checking the time. We do have 9 minutes and we want to open up the Q&A. So I'm seeing if anyone submitted any questions. Yeah, we do have a question actually from Hannah McCurry. She is our associate economist at the IPA. This is a question for Dr. Loomis. For projects developed in overlapping different tax jurisdictions, how is the property tax that is collected distributed? Is it by percentage of project in a location?
Yeah, it's going to be based on the number of megawatts within that taxing jurisdiction. So you look at typically, you can look at it by parcel number or PIN number, parcel identification number, and look at the number of panels, number of megawatts that's on that parcel. And then that parcel will either be in one, school district or another school district or in or out of a fire district and things. So essentially, you're right. It's if you look at a whole solar project, it's going to be based on the percentage that's within the boundaries for school district or any of those taxing jurisdictions.
Thank you, Dr. Loomis. See if we have any other questions. We don't have any questions. Actually, Hannah has a follow-up question. With the passage of prevailing wage MES standards for utility scale projects, do you see that having significant impacts on the distribution of construction and O&M jobs going forward?
In most projects that I've been a part of, there was already, I think, a sense of paying prevailing wage. Most of the utility scale projects were done with union labor and paid prevailing wage. But this is going to, I think, just ensure that fact. It'll be interesting to see, as Anthony said, there's a new project labor agreement that's required. And so how that gets negotiated may change kind of some of the terms associated with that going forward. But it's, at least from my vantage point, that's too early to tell. If anything, I think it is just going to raise wages rather than lowering wages.
Thank you, Dr. Loomis. We still have time if anyone wants to submit any question. Yes, from Lindsay for Scott. With the success of the solar farm on the closed landfill, is this a model that other closed landfills have considered?
Yeah, we actually had a tour and a visit with a number of municipalities organized by Prairie Rivers Network, municipalities that were interested in learning about our pathway. And I get calls from other municipalities. We readily share our request for qualifications document because we want more of this for everyone else as well. So I think it's a pathway that works, and we're happy to share our experience.
Thank you, Scott. I do actually have a question that kind of ties to sort of similar to Lindsay. With this project, kind of redeveloping the city's closed landfill as a solar farm. After this project, I know it's 80% completed, but have you seen any additional interest from communities, especially in Urbana, to go solar? What has been the overall, communities' feedback or interest?
Yeah, so if you think about that benefit stack that I described to the city, that's a unanimous vote in favor when we take that lease to city council. So there's a ton of support for that. As I mentioned, we've worked to share the low-income community solar subscriber opportunity with our residents. Our number one avenue for that is actually through our bulk solar purchase program, which is a separate effort called Solar Urbana Champaign. We do marketing and a series of informational solar power hours. And that program works to develop distributed generation, so solar arrays on individual homes and businesses on the roof. But for all those folks who don't own a roof, they're in an apartment or a condo, or don't have the cash up front, then we're sort of shifting them over to a community solar or a low-income community solar offtake.
Great, thank you. Again, we have 4 minutes. Any additional questions for our wonderful speakers? Yes, for Anthony from Dr. Loomis. How will interconnection problems affect IPA procurement? Will there be MISO PJM differences?
That's a very interesting question that we puzzle over at the IPA, because we see in our procurements entities that are ready to participate in our procurements. We don't have as good visibility into companies that are developing or considering projects and aren't ready to participate. So whether there's a bottleneck of people who are just not ready to participate because they're working through those issues or not, we don't always have great insight into. A few things that we've done to try to address that is, as we refine the requirements for projects to participate in our procurements, we have created more flexibility in terms of how far along in the interconnection process projects need to be in order to participate. So that may be something that creates some flexibility. We also to date have seen more participation of projects in the MISO service territory. This most recent procurement that was approved yesterday, we begin to see some bit more on the PJM side. So again, I think this is an ongoing sort of set of learning and seeing how those interconnection delays will impact participation. We'll have another procurement coming up later this year, and then in our next long-term plan, we'll be proposing the next schedule of it. So we have an ongoing set of procurements that allows, as people are ready to participate and work through whatever delays they may be seeing, that we'll continue to see the benefits of that. Another thing I would also mention is we have also over time created more and more flexibility in the procurement process for projects that need additional time to be completed, to have more time on the back end before they have contractual obligations to deliver RECs. I think obviously one of the huge learnings the last few years, not just on interconnection, but also on supply chains, is that everything is taking a lot longer than anyone wants them to. And being cognizant of that and adjusting our processes to reflect accommodations for project development cycles being longer than anticipated has been definitely something that we've focused on, both on our utility scale procurements, but also for distributed generation community solar projects. We've also sort of been building in that same sort of flexibility.
Thank you, Anthony. We'll take one more question, and this is from Jackson. He's also our new fellow here at the IPA for Dr. Loomis. With the passage of the IRA, are there any potential impacts on wind development in Illinois? From your perspective, what does the future look like?
Well, the future seems bright in terms of overall wind development. I think, as Anthony mentioned, some of the issues with interconnection for PJM is causing some difficulties, backups on projects that would be in the PJM territory, but MISO is there, and a lot of other states are opening up. So Illinois kind of faces competition from other states for siting of both wind and solar. But if it seems like we're getting our fair share, there's lots of permitting activity going on in the state over the last 12 months. A lot of projects have gone for permits and will continue to do that. So I think the future looks bright for Illinois.
Thank you, Dr. Loomis. I know Hannah had a question on brownfield, but Scott already answered that. So thank you, Scott. With that, I would like to wrap up this presentation. On behalf of the IPA, I want to thank everyone for joining our Power Hour webinar on the impacts of wind and solar projects to the local economy. I also want to thank our wonderful speakers for giving such an in-depth presentation and really taking us on a journey, renewable energy development journey here in Illinois. Like I mentioned earlier, a copy of this presentation and recording will be posted on the IPA website under About IPA Events. With that, I would like to wish you all a great weekend, and we hope to see you for July Power Hour on Unpacking Community Solar for Solar for All. Thank you.